Welcome back to another episode of the Future Cities podcast. I'm your host for the month, Stephen Elser. A couple of familiar voices will be joining me today for a conversation about extreme events and resilience in Hermosillo, Mexico, where they just spent 2.5 months. We have with us Jason Sauer, who is one of the co-hosts of the show. So I think this is actually the first time he's been interviewed for the show. Is that right, Jason?
Yeah, probably. We did talk about our research in Valdivia, but never been interviewed.
Yeah, that's true. We did have that Valdivia episode. So could you please just give a brief introduction for folks in case they haven't heard you before on your previous episodes?
Sure. So my name is Jason Sauer. I am a fourth-year PhD student or candidate now here at Arizona State University in the Environmental Life Sciences Department. I would probably classify myself mostly as an urban ecologist, but I kind of wear a lot of hats, I guess.
All right, great. Well, welcome, and thank you for being here. And then we have Yuliya Dzyuban, who was featured in a recent episode back in February called Heat and Thermal Comfort, where we talked about heat, perceptions of heat, and what affects those perceptions at bus stops in Phoenix, Arizona. If that's interesting to you, I'd encourage you to go back and listen. Welcome back, Yuliya, and could you also give a brief introduction?
Sure. So I'm a PhD candidate in sustainability, and I predominantly study heat and how it affects people and how people perceive heat depending on different types of infrastructure.
Great. Thank you, and thank you so much for being here. So as I mentioned before, Jason and Yuliya just spent 2.5 months in Hermosillo, Mexico doing research. We're going to talk a little bit about the research in a moment, but before I just wanted to give a very brief background about Hermosillo. So Hermosillo is located in northwest Mexico and is the capital and largest city of the state of Sonora. The city population is around 810,000 and the metropolitan area has a population of about 900,000. Manufacturing is a major driver of the local economy, and that really picked up steam in the 1980s when a Ford Motor Company factory opened. It is like Phoenix in the Sonoran Desert and has a hot and dry climate. It's also fairly close to some beautiful beaches, which I know Jason and Yuliya were able to enjoy on their trip down there. So with that, I guess I'd like to hear from you guys about what your experience was living in Hermosillo. You both have had such interesting lives and lived in so many different cities and so many different countries. So I'd really just like to hear what was it like living in Hermosillo? How did it compare to other places that you lived?
The food's definitely spicier. That's the first thing that comes to mind.
Spicy food, yeah.
Yeah, everything that gets put on your table starts out at like a 4 out of 5 on the American restaurant scale, but it's usually very good. That was like the first thing that struck, because of course I was starving when I first arrived there, but it was a constant theme. Yeah, there's more interesting stuff.
Yeah, food is probably the most vivid part of the experience. It was great, but I had to learn from my mistakes a few times, ordering wrong things in the restaurant, not paying enough attention, because one syllable in the word can pretty much change the taste of the dish.
So is there a story behind this? It sounds like
yeah.
something you have in mind.
Yeah, once we went to some seafood place and I ordered octopus tacos, which was, and it said taco de pulpo enchilado, and enchilada is a dish.
Yeah, right.
So I thought it's going to be something like enchilada with octopus, but it turned out that it was enchilado tacos, which means very spicy tacos. So basically, I just took one bite and cried.
No. Yeah, it's like chiliated taco, or like chiliated octopus is basically what it would translate to. Enchilado was very different. So, useful tip for the listeners.
Yeah.
Otherwise, though, I mean, Hermosillo is really similar to Phoenix, especially in terms of the climate. It's so I mean, we've been living in Phoenix for the last several years, and so Hermosillo is still situated in the Sonoran Desert, just southwest of Phoenix, or at least south. I guess I don't know how west it is, but south of Phoenix, probably by 5.5 hours, 6 hours, something like that, driving. So it's a little closer to the ocean, but you don't really get any of the humidity from it. I would say on average it's just like a couple of degrees colder, not really a noticeable difference. So there were a lot of really obvious like similarities in terms of the climate, which means the summer is pretty brutal there, but we're kind of used to it here in Phoenix. And then I mean the other really striking thing just about the city in general is like there were a lot of trees. I really kind of expected it to be a little more not barren necessarily, but not have the sort of tree cover that they did. Like just really green city, all things told, which was really impressive.
They have more trees than Phoenix?
No, I think I talked with the urban forester. Gosh, I've already forgotten his name. And I think they're right around the same canopy cover as we are here in Phoenix. I think they have less overall like green space in terms of parks, but in terms of the amount of like canopy cover, about the same. And they have a pretty different mix of trees too. A lot more broadleaf trees, which I thought was fairly interesting. But then a lot of stuff that I'm now seeing more of here in Phoenix that I think they're importing either from Hermosillo or I couldn't tell you necessarily the history of it, but yeah, it was really interesting. Really green city, all things told.
Yeah. Well, I think one huge difference is that there is no grass. So overall, their percentage of green coverage is much lower because there is no grass.
Yeah, and that's I think really important for heat because grass does a great job of cooling you down without that evapotranspiration.
Yeah.
So.
Right, but they have bigger issues with water than we do here. So.
Yeah, no grass, and also like very little yard space, especially in like the front of buildings to even install like a grass or kind of garden feature, which is kind of unfortunate just for the aesthetic of like walking around, but like there's so many shops there, and it kind of like works with the actual lifestyle a lot better, where it was like, yeah, it would be nice to have like more plants and stuff like covering, but also like, I don't know, just you walk around and there's just a million shops to like walk into, or small independently owned restaurants and things like that. And I think a lot of the grass cover in Phoenix is kind of associated with like these large strip mall complexes that just don't exist. So it's kind of an interesting trade-off, I guess.
Yeah. So you mentioned yard space, made me think of, I guess, in terms of the living situation of most people in Hermosillo, is there a lot of single-family housing units, or is it large apartment complexes, like going straight up into the sky, the skyscrapers sort of things, or did you get a feel for that while you were there?
I would say the newer complexes reminded me a lot of kind of the sprawl in Phoenix, or like the infill in between, like where all the farming land is leaving in Phoenix, and then like you're building these kind of gated complexes with like individual housing units. That was really similar to Phoenix in some ways. I think the gated community, like these little tiny micro suburbs that are just kind of like not fully, I mean, there's not like, you can't buy everything within them, but like there'll be a suburb and then like a couple of shops, like maybe a laundry place, maybe an OXXO, which is just a drugstore there. And then maybe a couple like small restaurants and stuff. So you do need to leave, but they try to like be relatively self-contained for like short trips. So yeah.
I think overall we were lucky to live in the city center, and that was like more historical area with older buildings, more like single owner housing, and it was pretty walkable and like really nice neighborhood. But I think majority of the population like live in places that look very different from
the city center.
Yeah, from the city center.
Yeah, and it's probably worth talking about the place where we lived because it's relatively unique. So again, we were right next to the city center, and I'm sure I'm messing with the details a bit on this, so Yuliya, feel free to correct me.
It was complicated story.
But we stayed in the second floor of this house that was constructed basically by a cattle baron sometime in like the 1940s or something, who then, so like just the sprawling kind of like, I mean, I say sprawling, it was a very large house. But coming from the Midwest, I've seen like McMansions that are definitely bigger than that. But I mean, like very large house, especially for the time, large yard space, and then like I guess the guy lived there for, I don't know, maybe less than 16 years or something before he died, and then it got passed on to Opus Dei, which is this extremely wealthy sect of the Catholic Church. So it became a place where a lot of priests and monks lived for a while, and then after that, I think there was some kind of lag period, and then it eventually got handed off to a couple of young architects and interior designers who converted this large space into what is now like what, 2 cafes. They're adding a bar currently.
Yes,
Wow.
there are stores, yoga studio, massage, like everything you want in one place. They want to do like a CrossFit studio.
Yeah, they're adding CrossFit. So it's this like
One-stop shop.
this weird like legacy building that instead of tearing down, they were just like, well, there is a lot of space here, and it is a city full of like small shops anyway, so they just kind of like kept the outside space and turned it into like this outdoor seating cafe space. And so there's, you know, a lot of variance, I guess, in terms of how like people are living in the city. Like they're trying to revitalize this downtown area and getting creative in that kind of way that they were with our location, but definitely not the norm. But there's kind of interesting like urban revitalization that's trying to work through, but then there's also just the normal sprawl of like, well, there are a lot of people and the city's growing and it's the capital of Sonora, so they're trying to balance that in the same way that Phoenix has these problems too.
So we've alluded a little bit to some of the extreme events that Hermosillo is dealing with in terms of heat and drought, but I was hoping just to hear a little bit more about the sort of the types of extreme events that they're dealing with, and some challenges that the city's facing in order to address these issues.
Heat is a major challenge, similarly to Phoenix, and I think even this year or last year, Hermosillo, there was a day when Hermosillo was the hottest city in the world.
Yeah, we had 2 days when we were there that it was the hottest city in the world.
Wow.
Yeah.
And it wasn't even the hottest day for Hermosillo in their own historical record on that day. It was like 118, I think, something like that.
That's pretty hot.
So
in early June, something like that.
Yeah, so it's pretty brutal. In terms of how they deal with it, I think they face a lot of challenges, in allocating resources for grid infrastructure. There are a number of projects that they are currently working on, but they're mostly, I'd say, mostly directed towards the downtown. And I know they also want to build one big park on the south of the city.
Yeah.
Yep.
I couldn't say much more than that.
Yeah. But overall, heat is still a pretty big challenge. And since I'm dealing with public transit, and more people use public transit in Hermosillo than in Phoenix, it seems like a larger issue.
You mentioned that they have more issues with water resources than we do here, and that might be part of the reason why they don't have so much grass. Do either of you know much about their sort of water resource management strategies, or?
They're relatively similar in terms of, or relatively similar to Phoenix, I guess, in terms of some of the solutions that they pursued. I mean, there's, you know, they trapped the Sonoran River, which used to flow freely through the city, and they constructed a dam. I forget when it was finished. I think it was the early 2000s. So they trapped the water source basically just to the east of the city. It's, you know, viewable from if you're high enough and can look over the mountain range. But that source is just one river, really, and it dries up over the course of the summer, and it gets dry enough in there where, I mean, there's plants that I wouldn't even consider like wetland adapted plants, and like portions of it that'll start growing in. So it stays dry for a while, and then so they also do a lot of well water, which is what the same strategy that Phoenix is now pursuing, given its own water shortage issues. So yeah, it's not really that different. They just have fewer potential sources to choose from, basically. Whereas we have like 3 different rivers that we pull from here in Phoenix, but they just have the one. Yeah.
And so it's a very dry place, as we've already mentioned, but they get most of their rain between July and September, sort of like what we experience here in Phoenix too. So do they have any issues with flooding during that time?
Oh yeah. So they have so I guess in terms of the weather situation or the climate, yeah. So they get most of their rains during that monsoon season. Again, the Hermosillo is basically west of the Sea of Cortez, and the Sea of Cortez also stretches to the south of them as well. So during the summer season, for those of you who don't live in Phoenix, we get these huge monsoons that blow up from the Sea of Cortez. But those monsoons basically get weaker the farther inland they go. So Hermosillo gets a more intense monsoon season than we do here in Phoenix, although they do not get the massive dust storms that we do. They do get some winter rains as well, but yeah, the vast majority, I forget, maybe 70% happens during the summer monsoon. Hermosillo also has a similar drainage system as Phoenix does, where historically there hasn't been as much of a focus on dealing with these like what we would call pluvial sources of flooding, which is just extreme rainfall that doesn't get absorbed by the landscape or by people's yards or whatever, but instead hits the pavement and then just like moves through the streets and causes flooding that way.
And so could we just quickly
Yes.
just touch, you said pluvial flooding, so could we compare that to other forms of flooding? There's fluvial, coastal,
Yeah.
so how is it differentiated from this?
Yeah, good point. So pluvial flooding, once again, is rainfall flooding, or just flooding that occurs due to rain coming into contact with surfaces that don't absorb that water, and instead that water moves over lands, over sidewalks, over streets, and basically kind of collects that way. Riverine flooding is one of the more common ones that cities are concerned with, which is basically just where you have enough rainfall, or it is also essentially caused by rainfall, but it is rain that enters the river system, and then the flooding that occurs is basically when the river swells beyond its capacity and comes over the banks of the river and then floods outwards into the floodplain. And because most cities are actually constructed in riverine floodplains, this is a major cause for concern, and is like the majority of the flooding that you deal with in cities that are not on the coast. And then coastal cities, of course, have this storm surges or events that kind of push the ocean into the city, basically. It can move up rivers and cause flooding, from the river system as well. But in general, coastal flooding is just like storm surges and hurricanes and major tides like king tides, causing the waters to swell and move inwards. Yeah. So yeah, they have the same sort of drainage system that we do in Phoenix, except I don't know that this exists in Phoenix, but they have actually designated some of the streets in the city as canals explicitly. So these are streets where people live and drive and have to do all of their normal errands that just during parts of the year are designed to flood. And I think the highest that I had people tell me was like 1.5 meters of water.
Wow.
That this is designed to ferry under a relatively short period of time. So it's an extreme amount of water, but is gone within a couple of hours in some cases, and then in other cases 30 minutes is what people were reporting. So relatively flashy, high waters in portions of the city. And then of course there's flooding in areas that aren't designated to be these canals as well. So a lot of disruption of foot traffic, especially in a city like Hermosillo, which is kind of designed to be walked around. And then also problems with driving and things like that. But then the streets flood, and then the water moves out from the streets, similar to rivers, and then floods the neighboring businesses. So there's a lot of major flooding problems in the city. I would say it's probably more sensitive than Phoenix to a similar rainfall event. I would say there's more flooding that happens in Hermosillo.
And maybe that has to do with the overall amount of green area that Hermosillo has versus what Phoenix has.
It's definitely not helping.
Yeah,
definitely could use some infiltration.
Yeah, more opportunities for infiltration here in Phoenix.
Yeah.
All right, great, thank you. That was great. So Yuliya, so recently you and I talked in a recent episode about your research focusing on how people in Phoenix experience heat at bus stops, and in that conversation you mentioned that you were going to go to Hermosillo to do some city comparisons about the same sort of thing. So is that what you wound up doing down there?
Yeah, sure. And my research kind of got expanded in Hermosillo. So in Phoenix I looked on mostly the rider's perspective and how riders perceive heat at bus stops. So I did the same in Hermosillo, but we expanded our sample of the stops, and we looked at stops across the whole city from north to south, and there were stops with different kinds of infrastructure, with trees and without trees, but also there were some newer designer stops in a way that were installed in downtown Phoenix, and that are very different from the standard ones. So we looked at those two. But then at the same time, we also kind of look at the more top-down perceptions of the public transit system and interviewed stakeholders of the public transit system from the state, from the city, director of the bus company, and also bus drivers. So I was trying to get like a more holistic picture of public transit system in Hermosillo. And I guess I need to mention that I think the first or second week since we arrived there was a major change in the system. And there used to be like 2 or 3 companies that were operating buses, but now they withdrew the concessions and gave them to new company. And there was a major strike. And right now, system is in a process of change. There is shortage of drivers, shortage of buses, but they're trying to upgrade and improve the system. So we'll see how it goes. So it was an interesting time.
Could you give us a little bit more information about just the state of public transportation in Hermosillo? So you mentioned there's a new company taking charge of some of the buses in the city, but could you tell us a little bit about like how spread out are bus stops, how long are waits typically for the bus? Do a lot of people use the bus, that sort of stuff?
Yeah, much more people use buses in Hermosillo comparing to Phoenix. So in Hermosillo, ridership is at 40%, and here in Phoenix is like 3% of total commute. So big differences. I think it's 312,600 users is a typical demand per day.
Wow.
So it's a lot. Typical waiting time is also higher, is higher in Hermosillo than in Phoenix. So it's on average around 17-18 minutes.
Oh, wow.
Yep, and there is no predefined schedule. There is an app where you can track the bus, but they don't come on schedule.
Is the app accurate?
I've heard different things about it. I think some drivers do not want to have the tracking device on their bus. So I'm not sure, I cannot confirm how accurate it is. And the total travel time is also much longer. So it's between 30 and 60 minutes for about 40% of their riders. So it's quite long. Considering that half of the buses do not have an AC, this is also a big issue and potentially health problem and thermal comfort problem. So right now there is I think there are about 300 something buses in operation, and if I remember correctly, there were 13 new buses when I started this. There were some so the system is represented by old buses, sort of mid-age buses, and then new buses. And old buses do not have AC, and then middle-age buses, some of them have AC and some of them do not, and then the new buses have AC. So there is a big mixture, and I think there were definitely less buses with AC than without as we came. But they are trying to change that and upgrade and buy new buses. And I've heard that since we came and started the campaign, we also installed sensors inside the buses to measure temperatures. So we picked a sample of 12 buses with and without AC, and of different buses of different ages, and installed temperature sensors. So we would go every week. We would go at night to the bus depot around like 10 p.m. and stay there until midnight and download data from the buses, because that's when buses returning back to the bus depot. So I've heard that since we've started the campaign, the company purchased about 170 more new buses.
Oh, wow, great.
I think it helped we did not disclose any data because it's still in the process, but you know, they were able to see when we download the data. But generally, just talking to people and about our research and that we install in sensors, I think it kind of built the momentum and made them, you know, to speed up their procurement for new buses, actually.
Awesome. That's really great news. Talking about how some didn't have AC, some did have AC, it made me think about whether the buses with AC have their routes in particular areas? Like, do you know whether the buses with AC and without AC travel the same places, or the newer buses in like nicer parts of the city versus older buses in like more like impoverished parts of the city, or is it sort of equal or equitable, I should say?
Yeah, I'm not sure. I'm not sure about that. I think they put new buses on higher demand routes. That's what my feeling is.
Great. Okay, so you mentioned you're still sort of working with that, but do you have any sort of preliminary findings that you can share with us, or just hunches that you have?
Yeah, like maximum temperature in buses without AC goes up to 50 degrees Celsius.
Oh my gosh! So, and what is that for in Fahrenheit?
This is like above 120, like.
Halfway to boiling.
and that's again for potentially a 30 to 60 minute bus
yeah.
After waiting 20 minutes.
After waiting.
In like 110 degree weather.
Yeah, so I think maximums in buses with AC go up to 36 degrees Celsius, which is around up to 90, around 90 degrees Fahrenheit. And then there are like the differences in the mean temperature. So in buses with AC it's 24 degrees Celsius, and in buses without AC it's like 30. No, I think in buses with AC the mean temperature is 27 degrees Celsius, and in buses without AC it's about 36 degrees or 34 degrees. So there is almost 10-degree difference.
Yeah, that's pretty stark.
Yeah. And from my interviews with like the stakeholders, they don't seem to perceive it as such a big problem. They're like, oh, people are used to it, And also drivers. We were talking to drivers and asking like, are there any accidents? Like, do people feel bad inside the buses? And they were like, no, everything is fine. Well, children sometimes throw up in the bus, and then we'll just put them near the window, and they just deal with it.
Children are growing up.
Yes, mild heat stroke, but nothing worse.
Yeah,
wow.
That's so good.
Yeah, well, that's a pretty interesting cultural difference there. I think that sort of thing were happening.
Yeah.
There'd be a lot of.
Yeah, I think people have like other issues to be concerned of.
Yeah.
It's like, is bus coming at all? They seem to be more concerned about the bus frequencies, and that the bus may not stop if it's full. It's basically up to the driver to decide whether he is going to stop or not stop. So if you're like at the bus stop for like 20 minutes and the bus doesn't even stop, that's a bigger issue.
That is a big issue. And do you know how frequently the buses are full?
Well, from the report I've read that was prepared for the city before they started upgrading the system, is that they don't really supply does not meet the demand, and that's why during the peak hours, like mornings or evenings, buses get full, and people they don't stop. Then people cannot get to work, and they even organize into groups and get a taxi. This has became like another issue in the recent years because the public transit system was so inefficient. Taxis started just to come to the bus stop and pick up people. So people, like 4 or 5 people, will come together and get a cab.
Anything else about what you did down there that you want to mention right now?
Well, I think from my general observations, people seem to be to have more adaptive capacity to heat. So I've seen mobile carts with refreshments come into the bus stops and selling drinks. I think it's a great idea.
Yeah.
I've seen vendors come into bus stops selling different small things like candies and cigarettes, bringing their own shade and into the bus stop. So people get really inventive and seem to have, just deal with the heat and not expecting a lot of action from the government, just being more proactive.
So you mentioned a term a moment ago, adaptive capacity, that I think we've talked about in this show previously, but could you just briefly sort of explain what you mean by that? You sort of explained via context, but could you just elaborate?
Sure. So, yeah, in this case, by adaptive capacity, I mean that people, whether they have resources or not, they're able to adapt to heat in a better way. So it's possible that they have fewer resources than people have here, but they're able to use them in a different way and be more creative with how they adapt to heat.
Gotcha. Cool. All right, we'll move on to Jason then. So Jason, could you give us just a short description of your general research interests?
Yeah, sure. So I think I've most broadly been concerned about vulnerability in cities. So vulnerability, I guess kind of broadly refers to how affected people are by a given extreme weather event. And in particular, I focus on flooding. So just to kind of break it down, you have basically if you have an event, like an extreme flooding event in a city, the first thing you have to do in order to be affected by a flooding event is to actually be exposed to it. Right. So you have flood water that's entering your house or that is interrupting your commute or something like that. And then in addition to that, you have to have sensitivity and sort of adaptive capacity to it. So sensitivity would kind of refer to like, well, how deeply am I damaged by this sort of flooding event? Like if my house gets damaged, do I have the economic resources to actually pay for a repair of this? Am I going to be going bankrupt because I've lost like the major economic asset that I have with this house, or things like that? And then adaptive capacity, we kind of talked about, would kind of be like, well, how can I make myself less sensitive or less vulnerable for the next storm event? So maybe I can go purchase sandbags and put that up, or do something to modify my house or my commute or something to reduce my exposure or sensitivity to this sort of flooding event. So yeah, I study how social vulnerability is different across different populations in cities. And then also I really focus on how flooding, especially pluvial flooding, so that surface, extreme rainfall flooding, occurs in cities, and I try to model areas that are particularly exposed to them, and then figure out ways that we can make cities less exposed or less sensitive to these sort of flooding events. The majority of my research from a previous episode that we did is in Valdivia, Chile, where I study how the city's network of urban wetlands is basically providing flood protection or storage for floodwaters in the city, and how altering these wetlands will increase or decrease the overall effectiveness or ability of the entire drainage network, which is connected to these wetlands, to deal with floods both now and in the future.
Perfect. So I think that sort of leads into then, what was your overall research question for Hermosillo?
Yeah, so my research in Hermosillo was, parts of it were just kind of very technical. Like we have this new model for flooding that myself and a couple other researchers constructed called a blue spot model, which basically is a very simple model that just takes information about the topography, or like the elevation of the land in a given city. And then you input a precipitation amount. So you look at like an extreme storm event and say like, okay, over the course of the storm event, we expect to see like 8 inches of rain by the end of it. And then the model outputs basically all the areas, in the city that will be filled to the brim basically with that flood water if you assume very minimal amounts of like absorption by the terrain of that sort of water system. So I had done this, I used this model for the city for a scenarios workshop that we did, which is where we bring in these practitioners and local groups and talk to them about the risks that they have for extreme weather events, and how to plan a more resilient city in the future. So I basically gave them the results from this model as kind of a jumping off point to talk about how to make the city more flood resilient in the future, just as a way to kind of demonstrate like these are potentially exposed areas to flooding in the future that we should maybe be thinking about, and these are the areas of the cities that are more at risk than others, blah, blah, blah. So the work that I was doing down there was mostly like actually verifying the results of this model. Mm. It's very new. I think it only really was published about in 2018 by Thomas Ballström, who's a researcher in Copenhagen, Denmark. So shouts out to Ballström.
We have lots of listeners.
Right, yeah. So anyway, this is a relatively new model. It hasn't really been verified in really anywhere except for Copenhagen, Denmark. And so this was a part of my research was actually just going down and doing what we would call participatory mapping exercises, where I just go out and talk to people and have them draw on a map basically the areas where they've experienced flooding in the neighborhood, and then to collect information about that flooding, such as depth, how long it lasts, and then the types of damages that it causes in their life or in their lives, and just try to figure out like how accurate this model actually is at, number one, predicting locations, but then like what can it potentially tell us about the kinds of experiences that we have if we have flooding on these types of land covers or whatever. And then I guess the other part of it was the city has a model for flooding already, but it uses totally different inputs and has totally different sort of like mechanical considerations, or the physics behind it are very different. So it ends up showing basically a different kind of flooding. And this is a very typical situation in all cities. Like every city has like some model that is in some way incomplete that they use to estimate the problem areas for flooding in the city, which they use as a supplement to like 311 calls or basically emergency calls from people on the ground who are reporting flooding. So every city has this sort of like incomplete picture, and the blue spot model potentially can provide a sort of supplement to whatever existing information they already have, and it's really easy to deploy, but again, it hasn't really been verified. So this was part of like, well, okay, what can the blue spot model actually tell us? How can it supplement the existing sort of data sets and estimations for flood risk that we already have?
Great. So, and for your research, you went and conducted interviews with people around the city to ask them about where and how they experienced flooding. So how did you go about selecting people that you interviewed?
Yeah, so I picked out 6 neighborhoods in the city overall, and basically, you know, using a geographic information program, I just drew circles of like 1 kilometer around a single point in a neighborhood, and then walked around on the ground from door to door and tried to interview enough people to kind of get what I would call saturation of zones, and basically just like go around until no one is really identifying new points of flooding that I haven't already heard about from other people. Or just until it got too hot and then I left. But yeah, so I ended up talking to a lot of businesses. I think I originally conceived of this as me talking to households, but it gets really complicated to do that in a city like Hermosillo, but it would be difficult in Phoenix too, and I'm sure many other cities across the United States, because there are a lot of gated communities that don't want to let some random person come in and harass their residents about like answering a survey. And who knows if my credentials are actually true or whatever. So it just ended up being a huge hassle. But people and businesses are standing around all day, and many of them, probably actually close, like 90% of the people I talked to were totally willing to do this mapping exercise and survey. So most of the people I ended up talking to were like small businesses, although I talked to a couple of employees of larger businesses too.
And so a lot of them were enthusiastic about participating. Did any of them have any like particularly memorable stories about experiencing a flood that you can remember?
I'm trying to think of any really good ones. I mean, I think the biggest takeaway I had from people's experiences were like, I mean, I would go in the neighborhoods that like neither of the models actually really identified as being particularly flooded, because I was also trying to figure out like, well, where are the shortcomings for both of these models, and you know, would like find a news story about this one like hospital flooding or something like that. And then I would go to those areas and just like talk to people about the locations and try to figure out what's the source of this flooding. And just like people deal with flooding very commonly there. I mean, like people's businesses, just water will enter the business like a couple centimeters deep several times a year.
Wow.
And so they just, you know, elevate all of their stuff slightly off the floor. So when you go talk with them, you'll get answers like, no, I don't really think flooding's a problem here. But I do get several centimeters of flooding every time it rains, because they're so well adapted, like just on the experiential level, that they don't even register it like as a problem anymore. There was one guy who, so I talked about the street canals where they divert large amounts of water into these very small areas. Especially along streets before it like basically goes underground into the limited drainage system that they have. And so old guy sitting on a porch, I walked up, asked him if he'd participate. He said, sure. And I asked him if flooding was a problem in the neighborhood. He said, not really. But I was like, well, there is this drainage outlet here, and this is a street canal. Does this actually, fill? And he was like, yeah. And I was like, how deep does it go? It's like 1.5-ish, and then like pointed to the mark on the side of his house where the water like would go. And I was like, this isn't a problem. And he's like, well, we put up this structure and it keeps the water out. I'm like, well, there you go. So it's just interesting, like, when people have to deal with this for so long, you have to really be careful with like how you phrase these questions, because very frequently they will experience flooding, but they won't necessarily even think to call it in or whatever, because they're just like, yeah, this is just my life. I've been here for years, and this is a design sort of thing. But is it a problem? I don't. It's just a sort of weird sort of interaction between like being used to it, and potentially there's questions about like their faith in the government being able to do stuff about it, where they're just like, no, it's not really a problem, I deal with it. Yeah, so those stories were like pretty common. I was really surprised at how many businesses I went to where they were just like, yeah, water enters every single time it rains.
So in this case, it seems like, going back to some of the terms you were using earlier, they all have like a high experience of flooding, but maybe a low sensitivity to it?
Yeah, I would say so. I think there's areas that definitely have just been flooding for a long period of time where they're just kind of used to it. But, and I mean, this gets to a good point about how cities develop, where so like as you are building outwards in cities and you're installing more of this impervious like surfaces, so pavements, rooftops, sidewalks, things like that don't actually absorb rainwater, you will create situations where there's potentially more flood water, because none of that water is infiltrating, and that water basically routes along the streets and sidewalks and things like that. So there are some neighborhoods that I would go to, and they hadn't experienced flooding except in like the last 5 years, and they would be like, it's because that development up the street or whatever didn't properly consider, I'm using the technical terms here obviously, didn't properly consider the basically what was going to happen to all the water basically that was pooling on top, and it just gets routed down to our neighborhood. Now flooding's been a problem when it hasn't ever been in the past. So it's not like the storms have changed, it's just patterns of development, and then there wasn't a full consideration of how to divert this water.
Yeah. So do you have any preliminary findings that you can share with us here?
Yeah, I mean, I think overall I would say the blue spot model, for like how like quick and easily deployed it is, I think it did a pretty good job of actually predicting areas and cities that are at risk for flooding. It definitely identified a lot of neighborhoods that experience flooding that weren't shown by the existing model that the city already used. Which kind of demonstrates that it's a potentially useful supplement. There were plenty of blue spots in the model, or like these areas that the model estimated as being problem areas for flooding, that people didn't really report on. I would say we probably, in a given neighborhood, 20 to 30% of areas that were reported to flood would also include like a blue spot or something like that. So not like a great sort of estimation ability, but it is a potentially useful supplement that gives you an idea of some areas of your city that flood that wouldn't be shown in these other models. But I mean, beyond that, a lot of the work I did was qualitative, and just trying to document some of these experiences that people had. And it's potentially going to be useful for flood reporting, or like rapid reporting of flooding in cities, because if we can create these sort of like broad categories for types of damages that people experience, like water entering home, water entering business, can't drive a neighborhood, can't cross streets walking, and things like that, and you can have that very quickly reportable by just checking basically a radio box or whatever in a reporting application, then the city can collect way more information, both about the types of flooding and the locations and things like that. So there's potentially some useful stuff that came out of it. And then just in general, I think it's a good lesson for modelers, like to actually go out and talk to people, because number one, you're missing a lot of locations, but number two, you're really missing out on like what flooding is for. Like, flooding is an experience, it's not just an observation from like a model. It's like this sort of embodied experience of like, yeah, I was stuck at work for 6 hours or something, and none of us had eaten you know, like during that period. So we were all like starving and just hoping that this flood would pass and things like that. And so I think you kind of lose the sort of human element and the rich experiences that people have, like with flooding, that is critical both for thinking about it, but also for conceptualizing what the problem even is when we talk about flooding.
Yeah, right. I think that's such an important point that so many scientists need to remember, is trying to bring in the human element to really have that connection to reality and people's experiences.
Yeah, and I mean, just the way we kind of like work, the more remote work that we can do, the better, because it's easier to do, frankly, true, especially when you're in a city when it's like, you know, over 110 degrees outside and you're trying to collect this information, but like you really miss out on so much. That is potentially critical to thinking about your work. So, yeah.
Absolutely. Okay, so we're wrapping up now, which means it's time for my favorite part of the show, which is asking people to share haikus about their research. Would one of you like to go first?
Yuli? That's the pro move. You speak up to volunteer someone else.
Jason's played this game before.
Okay, I'll go. Sun burns my feet. Where can I find a relief? I will dream of shade.
Beautiful. The haiku you shared with us last time was so great. That was also just very beautiful and artistic, and I don't think Jason will be able to learn it.
Well, I'll cop to that right now because I only wrote 2 out of 3 lines last night. I went to sleep not being able to think of a third one, so here's 2/3 of a haiku. High heat greets the wind. The gulf reforms in the sky. And then some third line about people.
Oh, you know. It was shaping up to be so
It was going well.
Yeah.
I know.
Really poetic.
I'll finish it. We'll put it in the episode description, or leave it incomplete for the listener to do on their own.
That's right. Choose your own adventure haiku. All right. Thank you again so much for joining me today. This is a really fun conversation. I learned a lot, and I hope our listeners did too. And thank you, listeners, for joining us. And we'll see you next time.
Thank you.
Thank you.
The Future Cities podcast is an outreach effort brought to you by the Urban Resilience to Extremes Sustainability Research Network, or UREX as we usually refer to it. To learn more about UREX, visit www.sustainability.asu.edu/urban resilience. If you have any questions, feedback, or suggestions for future episodes, you can email us at futurecitiespodcast@gmail.com or find us on Twitter at FutureCitiesPod. If you enjoyed the episode, please rate and subscribe to us wherever you get your podcasts. See you next time.